The Harrison family seemed to have it all, a life many admired from the outside. Richard Harrison, a wealthy businessman in his 50s, was well-liked and successful. His wife, Sarah, stayed out of the spotlight, focusing on raising their only son, John, a smart and ambitious college student. They often attended social events, dinners, and charity gatherings, fitting in perfectly with their wealthy community. But behind the perfect image, things were starting to change. John, who had always been close to his father, began to notice something was different. Richard, who had always been supportive and encouraging, started acting distant. His words felt colder, and John couldn't understand why. At the same time, John was in a serious relationship with Emily Daniels, a girl he met in college. Emily was different from other girls he had dated, kind, smart, and down to earth. They shared dreams of leaving their small town and building a future together. Emily worked part-time as a waitress but had big goals, while John focused on his studies, determined to succeed. At first, everything seemed perfect between them, but things changed when Richard started showing unusual interest in Emily. He would invite her to family dinners when John was busy studying. John didn't think much of it at first. His father was always friendly. Over time, though, John noticed Richard paying extra attention to Emily. He asked about her life, her dreams, and made comments about how impressive she was. Emily at first felt flattered, but soon she started feeling uncomfortable. Richard had always been charming, but something about his compliments and lingering looks felt off. Emily tried to ignore it, telling herself it was nothing. After all, he was John's father, but little things, his glances, his touch, started to make her uneasy. As time passed, Richard's actions became more calculated. He would talk about his success and the life Emily could have if she allowed herself to consider different options. He even gave her small gifts, nothing too extravagant, but enough to make a point. Richard made it clear that he could offer her a comfortable life, something John couldn't provide yet. Emily felt trapped between the man she loved and the unwanted attention from his father. She didn't know how to handle the situation. Whenever she tried to pull away, Richard would find ways to draw her back in with his kindness and persuasion. She still loved John, but Richard made her feel desired and admired in a way she hadn't experienced before. It was exciting, and over time she found it harder to resist his advances. Things reached a turning point one evening when Richard invited Emily to a private dinner while John was away. What started as a friendly evening soon crossed a line they could never undo. When John returned, he sensed Emily was distant. He confronted her, but she denied anything was wrong. However, their relationship had already begun to change. Emily's heart, once devoted to John, was now conflicted. Their love story had turned into a tangled mess that would soon shatter the Harrison family. John noticed Emily pulling away, and their once promising relationship started falling apart. Richard, always manipulative, took advantage of the situation, planting doubts in John's mind about Emily's commitment. He subtly suggested she might not share John's future goals, highlighting how important it was to have a partner who could support his ambitions. At first, John dismissed his father's concerns, but over time, the doubts grew. He began to question Emily's dedication, noticing how distant she had become. Conversations felt forced, and Emily's responses were vague and unconvincing. The more John thought about it, the more he doubted their future together. One evening, John invited Emily to dinner to talk. Sitting across from each other, he finally asked the question weighing on his heart. "What's going on? You've been acting distant. I feel like I don't even know you anymore." Emily hesitated, avoiding his eyes. "It's just been a lot lately, John. You know how it is." John pressed further. "I don't know how it is. You've barely spoken to me, and when we do talk, it's like I'm talking to a stranger." Emily sighed. "I'm just going through some stuff, okay? It's not you. I'm just not sure where I'm at right now." It didn't make sense. But then, the doubts Richard had sown began to surface, taking root in John's mind like a poisonous vine. "You're not sure about us, are you?" John asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emily hesitated, then nodded, her eyes full of sadness. "I think we need a break. I don't know if we're right for each other anymore." The words hit John like a punch to the gut. His world seemed to collapse around him. He had trusted Emily, believed in their love, And yet here she was, telling him that it was over. I, I don't understand, John muttered, his voice. No, John, it's not like that, Emily replied, her tone gentle but firm. I need to figure things out on my own. John was shattered, but part of him already knew that the seed of doubt Richard had planted in his mind was now bearing fruit. The breakup, though devastating, made sense in the twisted narrative his father had woven. Richard had been right all along. Emily wasn't the right person for him. She wasn't strong enough, focused enough, or ambitious enough to support his future. As John left the restaurant that night, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. He couldn't fully process the heartbreak he felt. He couldn't understand how it had all gone wrong, but there was no turning back. He had just lost the love of his life, and yet something told him that the blame wasn't entirely on Emily. His father's influence had been a silent force in their relationship, pulling strings in ways John couldn't yet comprehend. The weight of Richard's betrayal had been too much for John to bear. The man he once admired, trusted, and confided in had torn his life apart. And in a moment of unrestrained fury, John had lashed out. The fight had started with words, sharp, heated, and filled with years of suppressed resentment, but it escalated faster than he could comprehend. You took everything from me. John's voice trembled with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. First, you made me leave Emily, and now you're with her? Richard's expression remained frustratingly calm, his voice smooth but empty of true remorse. I did what I thought was best for you, son. You'll understand one day. Those words pushed John over the edge. Blinded by rage, he lunged at his father. The room spun in a whirlwind of motion, shoving, shouting, a chaotic blur of emotion. Then, without thinking, John's hand found the cold weight of an old family heirloom, something his father had always treasured. Before he could stop himself, he swung. The dull, sickening thud echoed through the house. Richard collapsed to the floor, and in an instant, the fight was over. John stood frozen, his chest heaving, staring down at the lifeless body of the man who had once been his hero. The silence pressed in around him, thick and suffocating. His mind screamed for him to do something, to undo what had just happened. But it was too late. Richard wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. And John's entire world had just shattered. Time lost meaning in the hours that followed. He paced the room in a daze, his thoughts a chaotic storm of guilt and disbelief. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Richard's face, blank, still, and drained of life. He wanted to scream, to run, to disappear, but there was nowhere to go, no way to change the irreversible truth. As the days passed, the weight of his actions settled over him like a suffocating fog. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. He could barely think without the crushing realization creeping in. He had killed his father. The guilt gnawed at him, relentless and unforgiving, and the temptation to confess became impossible to ignore. When the police finally arrived, responding to an anonymous tip, John didn't resist. He didn't have the strength to lie, nor the will to fight. He simply told them the truth. His voice was hollow as he confessed, but deep down, a small, broken part of him still tried to justify it. Richard had stolen his life, manipulated him, taken everything he loved. But none of that changed the reality staring him in the face. He was a killer now. The legal system moved quickly. Charged with manslaughter, John found himself trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape. The trial loomed like a shadow over his shattered existence, and no matter how much he wanted to undo what had happened, the damage was permanent. His once promising future had been reduced to nothing more than court hearings and whispered judgments. The dreams he had of success, love, and happiness were gone, replaced by cold prison walls and the unbearable burden of regret. John had lost everything in a single moment of rage, and now he would carry the weight of that moment for the rest of his life. John never thought the day would come when he couldn't look his father in the eye. But after discovering the truth, everything between them changed. What once felt like a solid bond had turned into a battleground filled with resentment and unspoken anger. For days, John avoided Richard, but every glance, every forced interaction only fueled his rage. He couldn't believe it. His own father, the man he had trusted the most, had betrayed him in the worst way possible. And Richard? He finally seemed to understand the weight of what he had done. But it was too late. One cold evening, John couldn't hold it in any longer. He confronted Richard, his voice tight with fury, but at first he tried to keep it together. The conversation started calmly, measured words, forced restraint, but it didn't last. "You took everything from me." John's voice broke as he stepped closer. "You made me leave Emily, and now you're with her." Richard's expression remained composed, his voice too smooth, too calculated. "I did what I thought was best for you, John. You don't understand." But John did understand. Too well. The words cut deeper than his father realized. In that moment, something inside him snapped. Before he knew it, his body moved on instinct, shoving Richard back. The older man stumbled, eyes wide with shock. The struggle escalated fast, hands grasping, shoving, years of anger boiling over. John's eyes darted across the room, landing on an old family heirloom, a heavy object within arm's reach. Without thinking, he grabbed it and swung. The impact was sickening. Richard collapsed to the ground, unmoving. John froze, his chest heaving, staring at his father's lifeless form. The silence that followed was heavier than anything he had ever known. He wanted to believe Richard would get back up, that this was just another fight, but the stillness told him otherwise. His father was gone, and John was the reason why. The hours that followed felt like a blur. He stood over the body, his thoughts racing in endless circles. He replayed the fight over and over, trying to convince himself it was an accident, that it wasn't his fault. But deep down, he knew the truth. The guilt pressed down on him, suffocating. When the police arrived, someone must have called them. John didn't run. There was no point. He confessed, his voice hollow and empty. But in the back of his mind, a small voice still whispered that Richard had deserved it, that everything he had done to John, to Emily, had led to this moment. But no excuse could change what had happened. Charged with manslaughter, John found himself trapped in a reality he couldn't escape. The trial loomed ahead, but it didn't matter. His life was already over. Everything he once had, his future, his dreams, was gone, destroyed in one moment of uncontrollable rage. And now he had to live with the consequences for the rest of his life. In the end, John's story serves as a haunting reminder of how quickly a single moment of rage can unravel a lifetime. What began as betrayal and heartbreak spiraled into an irreversible tragedy, one that left him standing alone in the wreckage of his own choices. The lines between justice and vengeance, love and resentment, blurred until they disappeared completely. Perhaps the most chilling part of it all isn't the crime itself, but the realization that sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones capable of inflicting the deepest wounds. And when faced with those wounds, the choices we make can define us forever.
Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more